There is a particular kind of life that happens in quiet rooms. Not the life the world celebrates, not the life that generates stories worth sharing at parties, but a life nonetheless. Rich, complex, fully inhabited. You wake in the same bed, move through the same rooms, return to the same chair by the same window. And to people who measure living by distance traveled or faces encountered, this looks like stagnation, like fear, like a life not fully lived. But they're measuring the wrong things. Because some of the deepest living happens in the smallest radius. The world has convinced itself that expansion is always outward, that growth requires new locations, new people, constant novel stimulation, that to stay in one place, to return to familiar spaces, to choose the known over the unknown, is to ossify, to stop developing, to settle for less than what life could offer. But this is propaganda. The insistence that movement equals progress, that novelty equals depth, that breadth is more valuable than depth. It's a story that serves economies built on consumption and restlessness. It doesn't serve the human soul, because here's what they don't tell you. You can travel the entire world and never leave the prison of your own unexamined mind. You can meet 1,000 people and never truly encounter another human being. You can fill your calendar with experiences and still be hollow at the center. External motion is not the same as internal development. And sometimes, often, the deepest transformation happens when you finally stop running and stay still long enough to meet yourself. Let's be precise about what we're discussing. This isn't about agoraphobia, or social anxiety disorder, or depression-induced withdrawal, though those are real and deserve their own examination. This is about something else, a genuine preference for the interior, for home as chosen sanctuary rather than default prison, for solitude as nourishment rather than deprivation. This is about people who have access to the world but choose, consciously and repeatedly, to limit that access, who could go out but stay in, who are invited but decline, who have learned that their optimal state exists in spaces they control, with stimulation they regulate, surrounded by silence they've carefully cultivated. The psychological research on this is more nuanced than the simple introvert-extrovert binary suggests. What we're really talking about is sensory processing sensitivity, the way some nervous systems are calibrated to register subtlety, to detect nuance, to be affected by stimuli that others filter out automatically. For these people, a crowded restaurant isn't just busy, it's assaultive. Multiple conversations happening simultaneously aren't background noise. They're competing demands for attention that the brain can't ignore. Fluorescent lighting isn't just bright, it's grating. The emotional states of strangers aren't invisible. They're palpable. This heightened receptivity isn't pathology. It's variation. The same trait that makes someone overwhelmed by a shopping mall makes them exquisitely attuned to emotional subtext in conversation. The same sensitivity that makes loud environments exhausting makes music or literature or film affect them with unusual depth. They're not defective models of human being. They're differently calibrated instruments. And like any instrument, they function best in conditions suited to their design. For these people, staying home isn't avoidance, it's curation. They're creating an environment where their particular nervous system can function optimally, where the baseline stimulation is low enough that they can actually think clearly, feel deeply, create meaningfully, where they're not spending all their energy managing sensory input and can instead direct that energy toward whatever actually matters to them. But let's not romanticize this entirely, because the truth is more complicated than simple preference. For many people, the love of home isn't just about optimal functioning. It's about safety. And safety, when you examine it closely, often traces back to a history where the world proved unsafe. Think about how this pattern develops. You're a child who feels things intensely, who picks up on emotional tension that adults think they're hiding, who gets overwhelmed at birthday parties with their chaos and noise and unpredictability, who needs more recovery time after social interaction than your peers. And the adults in your life, They don't see this as neutral variation. They see it as a problem. You're too sensitive. You're too shy. You need to toughen up, come out of your shell, be more like the other kids. So you try. You push yourself into situations that feel wrong. You force yourself to match an energy that doesn't come naturally. You perform enthusiasm you don't feel, and it's exhausting. More than exhausting, it's alienating. Because you're constantly betraying your own nature to approximate someone else's. You learn that who you actually are isn't acceptable, that your authentic preferences are flaws to overcome, that you need to be different to be worthy. Eventually, many people in this position make a decision. Consciously or unconsciously, they stop trying to fit themselves into spaces that weren't designed for them. They stop contorting themselves into shapes that don't match their actual form. They retreat to places where they can be themselves without apology. And home becomes that place. Not just a physical location, but a psychological state. The place where you don't have to perform, where your authentic baseline is acceptable, where you can exist without constant self-monitoring and adjustment. This retreat can be healthy. It can be an act of self-preservation, of honoring your actual needs rather than conforming to imagined obligations. But it can also calcify into something more rigid, into a fortress rather than a sanctuary, into isolation that feels safe but is actually just familiar. And distinguishing between healthy solitude and defensive withdrawal requires a level of self-awareness that's hard to maintain when you're inside the pattern. Because here's the thing about staying home. It can become a self-reinforcing cycle. The more time you spend in controlled environments, the more overwhelming uncontrolled environments feel. Your tolerance for discomfort decreases. Your window of optimal arousal narrows. What used to be manageable becomes intolerable, and you find yourself needing more and more insulation from a world that feels increasingly harsh. Is this adaptation or avoidance? The answer isn't simple. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes what begins as healthy boundary setting becomes a prison of your own making. Sometimes protecting yourself from overwhelm becomes preventing yourself from growth. The line between honoring your needs and limiting your life is blurry, and only you can determine which side of it you're on. Let's talk about what actually happens in all that time at home. Because the world assumes nothing, that you're wasting time, killing time, avoiding life. But for many people who choose this life, the opposite is true. They're not avoiding experience. They're having different experiences, internal ones that don't translate into stories that impress at dinner parties, but that are nonetheless profound. There's the experience of sustained attention, of being able to focus on something for hours without interruption, of diving so deep into a book or a project or a line of thinking that you lose track of time entirely. This kind of absorption is increasingly rare in a world designed for distraction, but it's where real understanding happens, where complex ideas can be fully metabolized, where you can actually think your own thoughts instead of just reacting to stimulus. There's the experience of creative development, of having the space and silence necessary for ideas to emerge. Creation requires a certain amount of emptiness, room for something new to form. But most people's lives are so full, so packed with input and obligation and noise, that there's no space for creation. The home dweller has space, and in that space things can be made. Writing, art, music, code, thought. The things that require sustained internal attention and don't happen in the gaps between other activities. There's the experience of emotional processing, of actually feeling your feelings instead of just moving past them to the next thing. The world encourages emotional suppression disguised as resilience. Keep moving, stay positive, don't dwell. But some emotions require dwelling. They need to be fully felt to be fully integrated. And that requires time and solitude. The person at home has that time. They can sit with sadness without needing to immediately fix it. They can explore anxiety without being told to just relax. They can process the complexity of human experience at the pace that complexity deserves. There's the experience of self-knowledge, of spending enough time with yourself that you actually know yourself, your patterns, your triggers, your genuine preferences versus your conditioned ones. Most people are strangers to themselves. They move through life on autopilot, following scripts they never consciously chose. But the person who spends significant time alone, they become familiar with their own inner landscape. They know what actually nourishes them versus what just distracts them. They know the difference between rest and avoidance. They develop a relationship with themselves that most people never access. And there's the experience of peace, real peace, not just the absence of stress, but the presence of something deeper, a kind of settledness, a groundedness, the feeling of being exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you need to be doing, without the constant low-grade anxiety that maybe you should be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. This peace is rare, and it's valuable in ways that are hard to quantify but impossible to deny once you've experienced it. But let's not pretend there isn't a cost, because there is. Staying home, choosing solitude, limiting your exposure to the world, these choices come with consequences. Some obvious, some more subtle. The obvious cost is social connection. Relationships require maintenance. Friendships atrophy without regular contact. And while you might have rich interior experiences, you're having them alone. Human beings are social creatures. We evolved in groups. We're wired for connection. And no amount of self-sufficiency eliminates that wiring. You can be content alone and still be lonely. These aren't mutually exclusive. The home dweller often tells themselves they don't need people, that they're fine on their own, that social interaction is overrated. And there's truth in that. Much social interaction is shallow, performative, exhausting. But some social interaction, the right social interaction, is essential. It's how we reality test, how we know we're not disappearing into solipsism, how we remember that other minds exist, with different perspectives, different truths, different ways of being. Without that regular contact, your perspective can become narrow. You start to believe your way of seeing is the only way. Your preferences become requirements. Your habits become rituals you can't deviate from. The flexibility that comes from encountering difference, from having your assumptions challenged, from being pushed outside your comfort zone, that flexibility atrophies. And you might not notice until you try to use it and find it's no longer there. There's also the cost of opportunity. Life happening out there, in the world, and you're not participating. Experiences you'll never have, people you'll never meet, moments you'll never be part of. And yes, many of those experiences would be mediocre or actively unpleasant. But some wouldn't. Some would. Be profound. Some would change you. Some would become the memories you carry for the rest of your life. And you'll never know which ones because you never took the risk of showing up. The home dweller has to make peace with this, with the knowledge that they're choosing depth over breadth, that they're prioritizing internal richness over external variety, that they're betting that the life they can build in limited space is more valuable than the life they could have in expanded space. This isn't inherently wrong, but it is a choice, and choices foreclose possibilities. You can't choose everything, and choosing home means not choosing much of what's out there. There's also a psychological cost that's rarely discussed, the way staying home can become an identity rather than a preference. You start to define yourself by what you don't do. I'm not someone who goes to parties. I'm not someone who travels. I'm not someone who does spontaneous things. These negative definitions feel safe, but they're also limiting, because they turn avoidance into essence. They make what you fear or find difficult into who you are. This happens gradually. You decline an invitation, then another, then another. And each time you decline, the next one becomes easier to decline. The muscle of showing up atrophies. The anxiety about going out increases. And eventually, you're not someone who prefers staying home. You're someone who can't imagine leaving. The preference has become a prison, and you might not even notice the transition. This is where honest self-examination becomes crucial. Are you staying home because it genuinely serves you, or are you staying home because leaving has become too scary? Are you choosing solitude from abundance, Or are you choosing it from scarcity? Are you moving towards something or just away from everything else? These questions don't have comfortable answers, because the truth is often mixed. You're staying home partly because you genuinely prefer it, and partly because the alternative feels overwhelming. You're choosing solitude partly because it nourishes you and partly because connection has disappointed you too many times. You're limiting your life partly as curation and partly as protection. And untangling these motivations is the work of a lifetime. What complicates this further is that the culture offers no nuanced language for this. You're either healthy and social or unhealthy and isolated. Either thriving in the world or hiding from it. Either an extrovert or a broken introvert who needs to be fixed. There's no space for I genuinely function better with limited social contact and have structured my life accordingly. No space for I've made a conscious choice about how I want to live, and it doesn't look like your choice, and that's okay. So the home dweller often feels defensive, like they have to justify their preferences, like they're always explaining why they're not broken, why they're not missing out, why their life is valid, even though it doesn't look like the lives around them. And that defensiveness can become exhausting. It can make you doubt yourself. It can make you wonder if everyone else is right and you're just lying to yourself about being okay. Let's talk about what changes as you age with this preference. Because the relationship to home evolves over time, and the reasons you stay there shift. In your 20s, staying home often feels like resistance. Everyone else is out there, forming their lives, making their mistakes, collecting their experiences. And you're home, reading, thinking, watching the same 4 movies that somehow never get old. Part of you wonders if you're wasting your youth, if you should be doing something more, if this peace you feel is actually just fear disguised as preference. The cultural pressure is intense. This is supposed to be the time of adventure, of pushing boundaries, of becoming whoever you're going to be. And becoming happens out there, right? Not here. In your room, in your familiar space, in your carefully controlled environment. But in your 30s, something shifts. You've seen enough of the world to know what you're not missing. You've forced yourself to enough social obligations to confirm that, yes, you really do prefer staying home. You've tried being someone else and it didn't take. The pressure lessens. Or maybe you just care less about it. You start to own the preference rather than apologize for it. You build a life that accommodates it rather than fighting against it. Your home stops being a refuge from the world and becomes simply where you live, where you work, where you create, where you exist. The defensiveness fades, mostly. By your 40s and 50s, if you've stayed this course, home has become a practice. You've learned its contours. You know what times of day feel different. You know what weather changes the quality of light through your windows. You've sat in the same chair enough times that it holds the shape of you. And this familiarity, which might look like stagnation from outside, is actually a form of mastery. You've learned to extract richness from limitation. You've proven that a life can be deep without being wide. But aging with this preference also means confronting certain realities. As your peers build expansive social networks, you've cultivated a small one. As they accumulate shared experiences with large groups, you've deepened a few relationships but maintained distance from many. When they retire, they have golf buddies and book clubs and social structures that will carry them through old age. And you have, what? Your rooms, your routines, your internal world. Is that enough? This is the question the home dweller faces eventually. Can this life sustain you through the entire arc of human existence? When your body becomes unreliable, when your mobility decreases, when the world shrinks not by choice but by necessity, will the life you've built be sufficient? Or will you wish you'd built more connections, maintained more relationships, created more external structure to support you when you need it? There's no easy answer. Some people who stayed home their entire lives reach old age content, complete. They've lived according to their truth. They've honored their nature. They have no regrets about the parties they missed or the trips they didn't take. They built something internal that sustains them. Others reach old age lonely, isolated, wishing they'd pushed themselves more, wishing they'd said yes more often, wishing they'd built bridges instead of walls, even walls that felt protective at the time. The difference between these outcomes isn't always clear while you're living. It's only in hindsight that you can see whether your choices were wise or whether they were fear masquerading as wisdom. And by then, you can't go back and choose differently. So where does this leave us? With complexity, with paradox, with the recognition that staying home can be both deeply right and subtly wrong, that it can serve you and limit you simultaneously, that it can be an expression of authenticity and a form of self-protection that becomes self-limitation. If you're someone who loves staying home, you don't need me to tell you it's okay. You know it's okay. What you might need is permission to question whether it's always okay, whether every time you choose home over world is a choice made from strength rather than fear, whether your relationship to solitude is healthy or has calcified into something more rigid. Because the goal isn't to stop staying home, it's to stay home consciously, to know why you're making that choice each time, to distinguish between genuine preference and habitual avoidance, to be honest with yourself about what you're protecting and what you might be preventing. Some invitations are worth declining. Some are worth accepting despite discomfort. Some social obligations are deadening, and some are enlivening. Some time. Alone is restorative, and some is just familiar. Learning to tell the difference is the work, and it requires paying attention not just to what you prefer in the moment, but to who you're becoming over time, to whether your life is expanding or contracting, to whether your choices are building something or just preventing something. The person who stays home by conscious choice, who knows themselves deeply, who has examined their motivations and found them sound, who has built an internal life of genuine richness, that person isn't missing anything. They've found what most people seek their entire lives and never locate: peace, self-knowledge, the ability to be alone without being lonely, the capacity to find meaning in simplicity. These aren't small things, but the person who stays home by default, who has let preference become prison, who is avoiding rather than choosing, who has let their world shrink not from wisdom but from fear, that person needs to be honest with themselves, not to force themselves into a life that doesn't suit them, but to examine whether the life they're living actually does suit them, or whether they've just convinced themselves it does because the alternative feels too difficult. Here's what I know. The world will always judge you for staying home. It will call you antisocial, asocial, reclusive, withdrawn. It will suggest something is wrong with you, that you're missing out, that you're not fully participating in the human experience. And sometimes, the world will be right. Sometimes you are avoiding. Sometimes you are missing out. Sometimes your isolation is protective rather than generative. But sometimes the world is completely wrong. Sometimes your staying home is the sanest response to a world that's genuinely overwhelming. Sometimes your solitude is richer than their community. Sometimes your small life is more examined, more intentional, more authentic than their large one. Sometimes you're not running away. You're running toward something the world can't see because it's internal, because it doesn't photograph well, because it can't be shared on social media, because it doesn't make sense to people who haven't felt what you've felt. The judgment will come regardless. So the question isn't how to avoid judgment. It's how to be so sure of your choice that judgment doesn't destabilize you. How to build a life that's so genuinely yours that criticism bounces off. How to know yourself well enough that you can distinguish between legitimate challenge and illegitimate pressure. And the only way to develop that certainty is through honest examination. Not the defensive kind where you're trying to prove the critics wrong, but the open kind where you're genuinely asking yourself if they might be right, where you're willing to sit with the possibility that some of what they're saying is true, where you can acknowledge the costs of your choices without that acknowledgement collapsing your commitment to them. Because costs don't mean you're wrong. Every choice has costs. The people out there in the world, constantly social, constantly moving, constantly experiencing, they're paying costs too. Different costs. Costs they might not even recognize. Exhaustion they've normalized. Superficiality they've accepted. Disconnection from self they've labeled as being well-adjusted. Their costs aren't more acceptable than yours just because the culture validates them. You get to choose your costs. That's the freedom and the responsibility. You get to decide which sacrifices you're willing to make. And if you decide that missing parties and limiting relationships and staying in familiar spaces is worth the peace and depth and self-knowledge you gain, that's valid. That's a life, a whole life, a complete life. It just doesn't look like the life the culture promotes. But the culture promotes a lot of things that don't actually serve human well-being. So maybe looking different from what's promoted isn't the failure the culture suggests it is. You are not incomplete for staying home. You're not broken for preferring solitude. You're not missing out if you're building something internal that has value. You're just different. And different isn't deficient. It's just different. The world needs people who dive deep more than it needs people who spread wide. The world needs people who think more than it needs people who perform. The world needs people who stay in one place long enough to really see it more than it needs people who touch everywhere but land nowhere. So stay home if that's where your life is. But stay there consciously. Stay there by choice. Stay there while remaining open to the possibility that sometimes, occasionally, the world might offer something worth leaving for. Stay there with eyes open. Stay there with self-awareness. Stay there honestly. And if you can do that, then your staying is not stagnation. It's cultivation. It's depth. It's a life fully lived, just on different terms than most. And those terms are yours to set.